Okay, here we go. Full screen. Silence. So my thesis is on the nature of silence within this text. First, the thesis. The unrelieved suffering of faithful Christians and destruction of nature seems to point to God's silence and distance from his children. However, God does not stop the suffering of his children because he is suffering with them. Instead, he speaks through the lives of those who are faithful to him, even in their sufferings. And I intend to prove this thesis by tracing the progression of Rodriguez's thoughts on silence throughout the text, from the first time where he conceives of the non-existence of God until the final pages of the book. So, the first piece of text reads thus. No, Kichijiro was trying to express something different, something even more sickening. The silence of God. Already 20 years have passed since the persecution broke out. The black soil of Japan has been filled with the lament of so many Christians. The red blood of priests has flowed profusely. The walls of the churches have fallen down, and in the face of this terrible and merciless sacrifice offered up to him, God has remained silent. So, because Rodriguez sees the continued suffering of the Japanese Christians, and because he sees no end to this suffering, his conclusion is that God is silent. God is not saving us from this suffering, therefore God is not there. He is not speaking into our lives. He is not aiding us. Therefore we can't hear him, and he refuses to be heard. The next piece of text points to how even the destruction of nature, the physical environment, reflects this concept of the silence of God. Rodriguez further thinks on the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah and how this reflects the silence, the absence of God. I knew well, of course, he says, that the greatest sin against God was despair, but the silence of God was something I could not fathom. The Lord preserved the just man when godless folk were perishing all around him. Escape he should when fire came down upon the cities of the plain. Yet now, when the barren land was already emitting smoke, while the fruit on the trees was still unripe, surely he should speak but a word for the Christians. And in Rodriguez's mind, he correlates speaking for the Christians with rescuing them from their suffering, with saving them from persecution and from perishing, and preserving them and punishing those who are godless instead. So because this is not happening, we see that Rodriguez is further enforcing the fact that God must be silent. However, in the last text, Rodriguez comes to understand that God is not silent. Simply because God isn't rescuing them from their suffering does not mean that God is not there. Instead, he says, in this text, the first part, Lord, I resented your silence. And in his mind, God answers back, I was not silent. I suffered beside you. So Rodriguez comes to see that what is perceived as God's silence is actually God's presence. God is with his fellow with the Christians. He is suffering there with them. He's not saving them, and maybe God isn't giving an answer as to why he's not saving them, but this doesn't mean that he's not there. And then in the second part of the text, Rodriguez observes that, even now, I am the last priest in this land, but our Lord was not silent. Even if he had been silent, my life until this day would have spoken of him. And this, I think, is the key to understanding the difference between God's silence and God's decision not to stop persecution, is that as long as there are faithful Christians who are not denying God, who are enduring this punishment, their lives are the words of God. Their lives are the things that are proof that God is there, that God is watching over his children. So, that's the end of my presentation.